All right, so let's talk about some other modern theories. They are a little less well fleshed out as the Sullivan theory or the Murray theory. The first one I wanted to talk about is the implicit personality theory. In this theory, we carry around with us implicitly, not consciously, not on purpose, but just implicitly. Sorry about my chirping clock. This belief that other people possess consistent personalities, that other people probably always act the way that we see them acting. So there are two different aspects of that have been offered as explanations for this kind of personality theory that we all carry around with us implicitly. The first one is the fundamental attribution error. This is our tendency to assume that other people are behaving the way that they are because that's how they are, that that's their personality, that they're always going to act like this. So with the fundamental attribution error, we're seeing, for example, let's say that you have a person who cuts you off in traffic. Your first guess is probably that they're just jerks or that they're negligent drivers. Something that is sort of like that's how they are. It's called the fundamental attribution error because we are attributing their behavior to something fundamental about them, but that's probably an error. That more than likely that person isn't inherently just a jerk, that they aren't always a negligent driver, that more than likely there was some kind of external factor that caused them to behave like that. Maybe their side view mirror wasn't set up correctly, so they didn't see that you were actually there. They thought the road was clear and they didn't mean to cut you off. Or maybe they are new to this area and they didn't realize that lane was closing down, and so they were sort of just in a panic and had to get over. They're like, oh gosh, this lane's ending, I didn't realize. Maybe they didn't see the sign because they were distracted from something else. They're not negligent drivers, but maybe they were, adjusting the radio at that moment or something and didn't see the sign that was telling them it was closing down. And now, oh gosh, the lane's closing down, I got to get over. But our tendency to immediately assume that other people always act like that, like however they are when we first meet them, that's how they are, is what's called the fundamental attribution error. We are attributing their behavior to something fundamental. Now, the actor-observer bias points out that we don't tend to do this for ourselves. Like, we know that our behavior is variable. We know the times that I didn't see the sign because I must have been looking down or looking over my shoulder or something. We know that we're new here. Hey man, give me some slack. I'm trying to find my way through this new area and I didn't mean to cut you off. This is what happened, right? Or I actually started to merge the other day into another lane, and I had looked over my shoulder. I had looked in my side view mirror, and I had looked in my rear view mirror, but apparently my side view mirror was set up for somebody else, and so it was not quite pointing where I'm used to it being. I looked over my shoulder, and the car must have been right behind the little divider of the front window and the rear passenger window. So I'm like, I think he was in that blind spot, not hitting in my rearview mirror at all. And I started to merge and they beeped at me. And I was like, they probably think I'm always like this, but a series of things all came together so that I couldn't see them. Like I literally couldn't see them. I wasn't trying to be rude. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. But it happens, right? When it's you go, I know, I'd never do this. This never happens to me. And when it's someone else, you say they probably do that all the time. And part of that's because we see ourselves across lots of different situations, and we see ourselves never having been honked at like that, or we see ourselves and what our intentions are. Like, I meant to safely merge, right? Like that was my intention. And I was surprised that I didn't have my mirrors set up because somebody else had driven my car. Like we know what our intentions are, even though our behavior shows us behaving negligently or selfishly or something like that. That wasn't our intention. That wasn't what I meant. right? Like what I meant was what was inside my head, but all we can, as observers, all we can see is what the other person's doing. As the actor, we know what's inside of our own heads. And so we are very unlikely to make the fundamental attribution error about ourselves because we know what our intent is. So the fundamental attribution error is one of these examples of an actor-observer bias. We see ourselves as actors differently than we see other people when we are the observer, right? Because we don't know their motives. We don't know them across time. The better you know somebody, the less likely you are to show the fundamental attribution error because you have seen them across lots of different circumstances. And that's why, you know, family and long-term friends, a lot of times we have fewer of these fundamental attribution errors going on. Oh, well, that must be how you are, right? Because with family and friends, they've seen us behave different ways. And so they're like, wow, that's unusual for you this time to be acting like that. If, you know, you're meeting somebody for the first time and you're late, they assume that you're the kind of person who comes late because they've never met you before. This is it. I've had this experience with students frequently when they'll miss the first assignment that's due in class and they'll say, this isn't like me. This isn't what I normally do. You know, I've been teaching college for decades and I've heard a lot of students say this isn't what's normal. This isn't how I normally am. And yet I'll grant them an extension on the first one that they missed and then they'll do the same thing on the second one. I'm like, okay, it's starting to look like a pattern at this point, right? So now I've decided I don't want to hear any stories. I don't trust my own instincts. I'm just going to have a blanket policy and I apply it the same way no matter what a person says because I don't know anyone. I don't know you. I just met you. This is the difference between when we're making assessments as the actor and we take all that stuff into consideration. You know, if you know for yourself that you've never been late on an assignment in a class ever, you've never asked for an extension. But then as the observer, I'm like, well, this is the beginning of a class. We've had one assignment and so far you've asked for an extension. So as far as I know, 100% of the time you ask for an extension, right? Like it looks different from the two sides. And that's where that fundamental attribution error can really kick in. So what this theory is basically saying is that we tend to be observers who assume that other people have very strong and consistent personalities. That's what this theory says. Now, I've been taking the perspective of the theory this whole time and talking about it this way, but I want to throw a little bit of wrenches into the gears here because this is a very sort of Western way of looking at the world. It turns out that if you go to other cultures, they don't display the fundamental attribution error to the extent that people from Western cultures do. And they are much more likely to take the situation into consideration and recognize that the person may have had to behave that way because of social pressures, other factors, other people's expectations of them, things like that. And so that implies that this is not something that we naturally do as humans, but that maybe we are societally encouraged to do in some societies and not as often encouraged to do it in other societies. So this is something that people vary on. Within Western culture, men are more likely to make the fundamental attribution than women are, on average. Not everybody perfectly, I'm just saying on average. So for example, a female in a collectivistic culture is the least likely to make the fundamental attribution error, and they are the most likely to invoke some situational explanation. Well, maybe their parents made them help with chores before they could leave, and that's why they were late. Men in a Western culture are the most likely to make the fundamental attribution error because they assume a lot of stability of personality and therefore expect a lot of stability of behavior. Men in collectivistic cultures and women in Western cultures are about equally likely to make the error. So there are some sex-based differences and there are some culturally based differences on the likelihood of displaying the fundamental attribution error, which makes it kind of hard to embrace fully this idea of an implicit personality theory as the best explanation of personality. But it's definitely a good explanation for why we might see people, especially from Western cultures, wanting to think that there's a stable personality. Like this might help to explain why it's such a popular topic for people within Western culture to try and figure out why and how we differ, because we carry around with us this implicit personality theory. We really have to always keep in mind, according to this theory, this next one, the power of situations. The idea that, some situations are so powerful that they'll override your whatever innate personality effects you might have. That you would behave in a way that's very contrary to what you would, as the actor, expect yourself to do. You can probably think, if you think about it for a few minutes, you could probably think of times where after some situation happened, you behaved in some way, you looked back on yourself and you're like, man, I never would have expected myself to act like that. The first thing that comes to my mind as a good example, and maybe this will work for you, is middle school. Middle school is a tough time where we are trying to fit in. We're trying to find our chums, as Sullivan would say. We've got this expanding network of chums that we're trying to figure out where we place and things like that. And so sometimes in middle school, we will do or say things that are even contrary to our own values, our stated values, the things that we think are important. And we'll be like, man, why did I do that? And a lot of times we don't really confront our inconsistencies until one of our chums, as Sullivan would call them, gets upset with us and says, I can't believe you did that. You left me hanging or did whatever that actually harmed me, and I'm your friend, and why would you do this? And I have never heard more frequently this phrase than I did in middle school. I don't know why I acted like that. It's not me. That wasn't me. And I don't think they mean that their body was taken over by somebody. They mean that is not how I see myself. Sometimes a situation is so powerful that we will actually behave in ways that are so inconsistent with our previous knowledge of ourselves that we're perplexed by it. And we're like, man, why did I act like that? Like, that's really bizarre. So we have to keep in mind that, we all as actors are reacting to the environment. Like, you can't come in usually and just buffalo through the situation and make everybody conform to how you want it to be and make every situation perfect for yourself. There are some situations that will demand that you behave in certain ways. So if we think about this little circular thing, right, we've got, a person's behavior will vary depending on the situation, but yet we still have at least certain components of our personality that are anchoring our behavior, right? And then, but it's a circle. Even those anchors sometimes can be affected by the situation. Even the most coherent parts of our personality sometimes can be affected by the situation. So keeping that in mind, let's look at this example of, so we have three people, and there's some degree of overlap in how much conscientiousness each of them has. But person C is the most conscientious in the group, and person A is the least conscientious in the group. And then on the y-axis, what we're seeing is how impulsively the individual reacts to something provocative in the situation. Maybe it's something threatening, so it's scary, or maybe it's something critical, so it might invoke like anger, something like that. And what we find is that the person who's lowest in conscientiousness is the most impulsive in their reaction to the situation. But there's overlap, right? Now, person C doesn't really overlap with person A. Like, person C is much more controlled in their response than person A is. But there's some overlap as we're going down this conscientiousness pathway, where person C sometimes will look as impulsive as person B does. And sometimes person B will look as impulsive as person A, depending on the situation and depending on what this provocative situation is, right? So we can't expect to know, okay, if you're a conscientious person, you're probably not going to react impulsively. There are probably times we could get you to behave impulsively, no matter how conscientious you are, for example. So when we talk about the power of situations, usually what we try to do is average your behavior across lots of situations to try and determine how consistent your behavior is. There's always a reliability issue when we try and measure your behavior across situations, because it's possible that your behavior is very consistent, but our way of measuring it is not very reliable. It's not very consistent. And so you may be behaving similarly, but given the changes in context or the number of people that are there or other factors, our tool may lose some of its reliability. And then the other thing we have to worry about when we use consistency across situations as our way of establishing, consistency of behavior or personality, we have to worry about whether each situation is really similar to the other, right? Like if I compare your behavior in class in high school to your behavior in class in college, we might say, well, they're both classroom situations, and let's just assume they're both face-to-face experiences. So we would say, well, they're both classrooms, right? They both have chairs, they both have students, they both have an instructor, they both have, this sounds like the same basic thing. But I think there are a lot of factors that make a high school classroom very different from a college classroom. And so are these really the same situation? In what ways are they different? And are those ways that they're different enough to elicit different behaviors out of you, right? So we have to be really careful about saying, well, you behave the same way across different situations. The other way that we can assess how much the situation influences our behavior is to aggregate. So we might say, let's pull together lots of different situations, not just high school versus college class, but let's say work or playing a sport or hanging out with your friends. We just have a whole bunch of different situations and we aggregate all of them together, looking for the consistencies in your behavior, regardless of how similar the situations are. So aggregation includes lots of different kinds of situations. So we get rid of the problem of the appropriateness of the situation. It helps to deal with the reliability issue because we're acknowledging that the measure may not be that powerful, but as long as we're applying it to lots of wacky, different, dissimilar situations, hopefully that reliability issue will go away. Well, I want to show you a video next that really gets at the power of the situation to cause you to behave in ways that are different than you might have expected. As you can see, my PowerPoint is revealing that when you go to watch it, it's going to ask you to verify how old you are. And if you're under 18, you'll have to tell it you're over 18. And it doesn't even ask me anymore. So I guess it knows how old I am, which is kind of offensive. But anyway, so hopefully you can watch it. There is some profanity in it, but there's profanity in lots of YouTube videos. So I'm not exactly sure why you're blocked from this. But what it's showing you is the Stanford Prison Experiment. And you may or may not have heard of this before. You may or may not have seen it before. But I think this is a really good little documentary to show you, how powerful the situation was to influence the prisoner's behavior and the guards' behavior, but also the researcher who ran it, Phil Zimbardo, he played the role of warden, and you'll hear him talking about how much the situation influenced his behavior in ways that he didn't expect. So go ahead and watch this video, and I'll see you on the other side.